So next up, we've got Jana. Jana Wendler, who I've worked with in the past. Those of you who attended an internal program event will have heard my side of what Jana's going to talk about, but she's going to talk about the game Downpour that she designed and that I chipped in a little bit and got involved with. And so I've talked to some people about it from the more academic side of things. Jana's going to talk about the actual game design side of things. So off you go, Jana.
Okay, I'm just going to share my screen. Is that okay for everyone?
Yeah, it's great. Thanks.
Well, I very much hope that I will, fit in with what Emma has already told you. So I hope it's not too much of a contrasting perspective. Yes, thank you very much for having me for this session today. And it's really exciting talking about Downpour now, because as I was putting this together, I realized we actually made this game back in 2016, so quite a few years ago. But it's one of those that kind of keeps coming back, and every time I reflect on it, I kind of see new things in it, and I think it's really interesting to explore it again. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the game and a bit more widely about street games as a mode of research communication, particularly in the context of flood risk. And I'll say a few words around the design and also the impact of this particular project. So the premise of Downpour is that our players are flood risk advisors to Manchester, and they are faced with a kind of imminent threat of having to save the city against a flood. And the very first version of it was quite a large-scale street game event. So it was a 1-hour event that people played in teams of 5, and they would go through this quite extensive journey of making decisions, of meeting characters, of doing little treasure hunts, so kind of a whole range of little games. And ultimately they were building up knowledge and expertise and points to take some decisions against a future flood. And the game took place in an area of Manchester called Castlefield. So it was partly indoors, partly outdoors. People moved through the city, and it was quite a kind of big dynamic process, really. If you're not familiar with street games and this kind of approach, just imagine kind of a mix of interactive theater, some kind of ideas from escape rooms that you might be familiar with, but also more traditional kind of treasure hunts. So it's a real mix of media. And I also collaborated on this project with a group of filmmakers called Pendula Productions. So we had video elements in it as well. Alongside this large version, we then ended up making a smaller scale festival version of Downpour, which really took the same framing and the same kind of decision making and the same content, but scaled it right back to something that could be run at a festival around a stall, essentially. So rather than having, a team of kind of 15 actors and volunteers, we scaled it back down to about 3, and moving from 1 hour to about 15 minutes. So I just want to say a few words about physical and street games. And Sam has already introduced you to the value of games in a kind of science communication, public engagement context. And I totally echo all of that around the safe space. I think for me, the key is really around player agency. So giving players or participants a chance to take decisions, to either speak their mind or perhaps take on a role, but really being active in the process of engagement. But what I think makes street games and physical games special is that they really focus on a kind of in-depth engagement. So as I said, the event was an hour long. That's quite a long time to spend with a topic. It doesn't mean that you can't have, perhaps hundreds and hundreds of participants, but those people will be really delving into some detail and some nuance around the theme. It also gives you the chance to have some really interesting conversations. So players will be having conversations in the game, either with characters or perhaps with actual scientists. And the festival version of Downpour included scientists as part of the game. So players would get introduced, and then they would kind of move on to have chats with scientists about their research, and then bring those ideas back to their decision making in the game. And that's really quite a strong way to learn and to have an interaction. And I'm also really excited about the engagement that you get from physical and tactile learning. So moving around the space, you know, kind of interacting with objects. I think that's really, really powerful. Street games also have a relationship to place. So in our case, it was Manchester, you know, running the game next to the canals and close to the rivers where flooding actually took place. And they also fit in really well with the rise of kind of science festivals and science events. And I think there's something here around moving away from the idea of science communications being kind of purely educational. It can be fun as well. It can be really exciting. And there's some really interesting combinations of arts and sciences that are taking place now. And I feel street games tap into that. Perhaps at this point, it's worth to do a little COVID exclaimer. So it's obviously not been a great year for this sort of work, with no festivals taking place. But also, I've been really reluctant to sort of take this work online, because all the things that I just said that make physical games special are really difficult to replicate online on a kind of one-to-one basis. So I think if we wanted to move this kind of work online, we'd really need to redesign it rather than just sort of doing a bad copy of it. And so my approach has been to kind of pause it for now, and perhaps starting to think around socially distanced events in the future. So this is kind of my little COVID take on this work. So coming back to Downpour and the design, the background to the project was really a conversation with the Manchester Climate Change Agency in 2016, who were launching the climate strategy for Manchester at the time, and who wanted to find ways of engaging the city in those discussions. And we quite quickly settled on flooding as a good focal point, and some previous presentations already talked about flooding as something that's very easy to connect to. There's lived experience behind it. People have something to say on it. And obviously Manchester had a very recent history of flooding at the time, so it was a very relevant topic to explore climate change issues around. And then as sort of the partnerships in the project grew, sort of each stakeholder brought further ideas and further kind of objectives to it. So in particular, my work with researchers from the University of Manchester, including Emma, in discussing the science behind flooding and the kind of issues that are important, we quite quickly found we wanted to talk about flooding as an integrated issue. So it's not just about there's too much rain in Manchester, it's about what happens upstream and downstream. And getting people to think about landscape, around management, around degradation, sort of all these topics that perhaps don't seem to be related to flooding at first sight, but are very integral to it. And additionally, the filmmakers I was working with had quite a strong kind of environmental campaigning background as well. And that brought focus onto the politics of flood risk management. So even if we perhaps have a good idea from the science what we might need to be doing, there are political obstacles to actually taking action. And I just want to show you an example of how that featured in the game. So at the time, the discussion around grouse shooting was very big. There was a petition going on, there was a debate in Parliament, and there was a real big concern around banning these damaging land management practices related to grouse shooting. And in the game, we have a point where players get to choose a policy to take forward into Parliament and to make a big change. And one of the options is to try and put through a ban on drilling grouse shooting. And we made that a really controversial policy, high value, but high controversy level. Now, what did that mean? So this is what our Parliament looked like. And it was essentially a little DIY Skittle alley with Skittles kind of mirroring politicians, or politicians' heads, which would perhaps need a little upgrade now. But players would roll a bowling ball, and the more controversial their policy, the higher the opposition would be, and the more Skittles they would have to knock down. So we were really working here with metaphors, with satire, with kind of getting people to explore the politics in a very, fun, but also, again, this embodied way. Rolling bowling balls to bowl over the opposition, for example.
A minute to go, Jana.
And this is just a little insight of kind of how we work with these topics within a game context. Talking a little bit impact and the legacy of the game, I want to start by talking about a few things that the game didn't do. So after running at the Science Festival for a couple of days, we unfortunately never got a chance to do the full version again. And that's purely because it was very expensive. It required a lot of people, a lot of resources to run. So we transitioned to using that smaller festival version in various settings. It also never got to run in a context outside of Manchester. So the game was shown at places outside of Manchester, but it always worked with the Manchester context. And I've had a lot of conversation over the years with people that were interested in bringing the game to their city. But one of the big obstacles was that the content was very Manchester specific, which is great for what we used it for initially, but it did restrict how applicable it was to other places. So it was developed, which required a lot of new resources that we never quite managed to get together. It also never quite managed to feed back into policy. So when we with Manchester City, the idea to start the conversation with climate change agents was to have an outreach, a communication event, an engagement event, but ideally also something that would ideas back. And I do think there's a lot of potential here to collect players' choices, to talk to them about the decision making, to have reflections. And we actually collected a lot of video shots at the time, but because it was never a primary objective, it sort of fell out of the development process. And we never got to use that in a real meaningful way. And I would definitely encourage people thinking about games to really think about that two-way connection. So not just transmitting ideas and getting them out there, but getting feedback back. And I think there's, it's definitely powerful potential. And in a similar way, I think Downpour could have had a potential as a real community engagement tool as well. So actually working with communities affected by flooding and perhaps exploring local controversies or local issues in a more direct way. And again, using that safe space that Sam was talking about earlier. But we've not used it in that way, although we are having some conversations at the moment with Cumbria Wildlife Trust and the potential of bringing that game into some of the discussions that they are having in Cumbria. Now on to what the game did do.
Sorry, Jana.
It definitely introduced players to ideas around flooding that they perhaps didn't think about before. So we did a quick evaluation afterwards, talking about the learning that people had from the game. And there was a real strong focus on, wow, I'd never thought about the uplands, or, I'd never thought about the relationship between grouse shooting and lack of trees and how that might link to the water that we see in Manchester. And I think that's really, really powerful, kind of opening people to these bigger connections that are quite hard to really, kind of follow through and really get a grip on. The game ended up being used in various formats for teaching and for outreach, as well as conference presentations and festivals. So it actually had quite a diverse life after the initial Science Festival event, which is really great to see. So definitely worth thinking about how it can be adapted for those different contexts, particularly if it's such a big event. It certainly had a big impact on my work as a games designer. So my background is in geography as well. But this was really the starting point for me to take a much bigger step into working with game-based research communication and learning. And I've been doing a lot of projects in different fields since then, and have now started to work under my own social enterprise with that work as well. And I think Downpour was a real, a massive stepping stone on that path. And similarly, it really fostered a partnership with Emma that I don't think would have happened in the same way otherwise. So as Emma mentioned initially, we started just to kind of share ideas, and she was essentially the scientific advisor on the project. So it was very, this kind of traditional model of here's the science, and then the creative practitioners kind of work with those results. And it was, you know, me chatting to Emma and her drawing little diagrams for me at the time. But we found quite quickly that really we wanted to collaborate in a more meaningful way. So Emma became really actively involved in running the game. So the festival version has scientists, Emma and her colleagues, as part of the game structure. And she'd be talking about her work and about her NFM projects, and then players would bring that back into the game. So I think for Emma, it was also a chance to be more creative in her public engagement work. And I think as a next step, I would argue that we actually ended up doing some real interdisciplinary knowledge creation here. And the image on screen is us presenting at the EGO conference a couple of years ago. And we also published a paper on our collaboration and on the potential of street games in this kind of flood risk management context. So I think when we talk about these communication approaches, as well as being useful in a public context, I think they're also really important for our own interdisciplinary development and these kind of art-science partnerships. And yeah, I'm just really excited that we're still having this conversation 4 years on, and we're still getting interest in the game. So I'd be really interested to hear ideas, potential uses for it. I would still like to bring it back to life more fully at some point. So I'm open to ideas, and I would even entertain an online component if it was well designed. And yeah, that's it for now, really. So thank you very much. And if we have time for questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Brilliant, thanks, Jana. I think that was a good compliment to the talk I gave the other day. Same messages, very different angles coming at the same thing though. I'm afraid we don't have time for questions because we need to keep to time for the next session. But there are a couple of questions on the chat, Jana, so if you could type those in as responses. Thank you very much for sharing that about downpour.